morning. We're glad you're here. If you have your Bible or your phone, go to Matthew chapter 2. Just want to say again how thankful we are for Anita and her team. They were here about 3 hours yesterday morning. I came back late last night. They were here. And then all those little guys you saw running around here have all been here since 8 o'clock with no naps. So they, it's going to be a big afternoon at their house, but if you see Anita and her team, thank them for all the work they do. Now, I know this is an exciting time of year for a lot of people, but for a lot of us also, it's a very busy time of year. When you get to December, there are certain things that you have to deal with that you don't do the other 11 months of the year. For example, when the calendar gets to December, you're going to have to spend some time buying gifts, decorating your house, planning the meals, and all the Christmas pageants and Christmas parties and all the stuff that goes with the Christmas celebration. But there's something else that many of us will participate in over the next couple weeks, and that's some sort of a road trip. Now, you may be in a situation where all of your family lives within walking distance, but for most of us, there's going to be a point in the next couple weeks where we'll get in a car and drive somewhere to hang out with our extended family. According to AAA, it's predicted that just over 100 million Americans will travel over the next couple weeks, which is basically 1/3 of the population. And I don't know how it is for you, but when I get in the car to go somewhere, I have this personal goal of getting there as quickly as possible. Like, I don't want anything to stand in the way. So if I type in an address on my GPS on my phone and it gives me, the expected arrival time, I take that as a personal challenge to beat that time. Now, maybe you can relate to that. I don't know why that's important to me, but it is. But over the years, I've traveled quite a bit, and there's some things I've learned. And one of the things I've learned is that when you're traveling, especially when there's somewhere in particular that you want to be, it's very likely that you're going to encounter some things that slow you down that you have zero control over. For example, maybe you're driving somewhere, you're going down the road, and you see a sign that looks like this one that I'm going to show you. You ever run into one of those signs? You got high water. Now you have a decision to make. You can try to force your way through, or you can find an alternate route, but the one thing for sure, it's going to slow you down. Here's another sign you see this time of year especially, ice on the road. You can either try to, just skid across it and hope you make it and risk, sliding off the road, or you can slow down and take your time and be careful. But one thing for sure, it's going to slow you down. Here, the next sign is the one that I hate the most. You ever run into this? It never fails. Like, if I don't have anywhere to be, I never see this sign. But if I've got a deadline to be somewhere or an important appointment, this is the one I'll run into. Construction, accident, whatever it is, expect delays. Here's another one you'll sometimes see. Road closed. Seems like this is usually, you have this path that you're trying to plan. You've got everything figured out, and then you get on a certain road, and it's closed for construction. And I don't know how it is for you, but it seems like for me, you'll follow the alternate route, and the whole time your GPS hasn't updated, and it's telling you to return to the route, and you get in sort of an argument with somebody that's not even real. You know what I mean? You ever done that? One more. This is one you'll see quite a bit, and it's the one that a lot of us don't like at all. It's the detour sign. This is the one that lets you know that the path that you planned on taking is not going to work, and you're going to have to follow a different path. And I don't know how it is for you, but for me, I get nervous on detours. I usually, especially if you're in an area that's unfamiliar, you're not sure where you're going. Usually a detour is not as smooth, the road's not as clear, the direction's not as clear. And usually it's slower. But there are some good things about detours. Sometimes if you're on the interstate and it's closed for construction or there's an accident, you get off the interstate, you get on some of the side roads, and you'll find things that you didn't know existed. You'll find these, super cool little small towns. Maybe you'll find restaurants you never heard of. You'll see historical sites. So sometimes on a detour, you experience things that you never would have seen had you stayed on the main road. One travel writer said sometimes the most scenic roads in life are the detours that you didn't mean to take. I think that's true. As I've thought about this over the last couple weeks, I've decided that in many ways, life sort of mirrors a road trip. When you're going up, you have this plan for how your life is going to go, but then you embark on the journey, and pretty soon, usually sooner rather than later, you find yourself facing all these different twists and turns. It's not smooth sailing. Sometimes the road you thought was going to be open is closed. Sometimes you encounter unexpected delays, and every once in a while, you find yourself taking a detour. If you have your Bible, open to Matthew chapter 2. The very first Christmas, from the perspective of Mary and Joseph, must have felt like one detour after another. I'm sure Mary was just like us. You know, she had this plan for how she expected her life would go. She'd grow up, she'd fall in love, she'd get married, she'd probably spend the rest of her life living within sight of where she was born. She'd eventually have children. Her children would grow up, Mary would grow older, and then she would die, and that would be her life. But that all changes when an angel shows up and says, "Greetings to you who are highly favored." You talk about a big detour. Can you imagine what that must have felt like? As we pick up the story in Matthew chapter 2, Jesus has already been born. In fact, he's now a toddler. And in Matthew 2, you have this strange set of guys known as the Magi or the wise men. Sometimes we call them the three kings who come from somewhere in the east. They're kind of mysterious, and they've seen a star that indicated that this new king has been born. So they went and they searched out this newborn king. But by the time they arrive, Jesus is already between 6 months and 20 months old. So if you go home today and you've got your decorations out, and you've got the wise men at the nativity scene, you need to move them to another room just to be more accurate. It took them a little while to get there. Most of our Christmas plays, like we just saw, are kind of the condensed version. So these guys set out. It's a long journey, and when they get to the area, they encounter a paranoid old king named Herod. I've got a picture of Herod, kind of a rough-looking character. Upon hearing about this potential rival, Herod sets in motion this plan to eliminate Jesus. So it's important to remember, from the very first moments of his life, Jesus had an enemy that was out to get him. And if you were going to make an enemy, Herod is not the guy you would want. Even though he was sort of a puppet of the Roman Empire, he was a guy that was known as a vengeful, brutal tyrant. He was sort of obsessed with his own ego, so as part of his kingdom, he would build all these huge buildings and put his name on it. One of the things he did, in addition to his building projects, though, is he ruthlessly eliminated anybody he saw as a threat. So as his first act as king, he gathered together the 70 members of the Jewish Sanhedrin, which was kind of like the Supreme Court and the Congress all rolled up into one, and he had them all executed because he didn't want there to be any question about who was in charge. Later, he executed his wife, his mother-in-law, and all of his children from his first marriage when he thought they were conspiring against him. Even later, in order to finance some of his own building projects, he gathered together the 45 wealthiest people in Israel, had them all executed, and he confiscated their money. So this is a guy that did not get invited to many Christmas parties. This is a guy that if you saw him coming, you knew to get out of his way because he was not a man to be messed with. At the end of his life, he got really sick and suffered a prolonged illness, and the people were ready for him to die. So he gave his army an order that when he died, he wanted them to go out and execute 300 of the leading citizens of Israel so that when he died, at least the people would be crying. But thankfully, that order was never carried out. So here's this guy. He's got this king that's been born. And if he's the king, he knows there can't be another king. So you have this battle that takes place. And he comes up with this plan to eliminate Jesus by having the wise men give away Jesus' position. But thankfully, they were too smart for that. Check out verse 9 of Matthew chapter 2. After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. So that's kind of the first detour in the story. They came from one direction. They're going to have to go back another direction. But it's not the biggest detour in the story. Check out verse 13. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, Take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." Now here's Joseph with his new family, and rather than sitting around waiting for first words and first steps, it's going to be a fight for survival. It's going to be a journey to a place he's never been before, where they speak a language he doesn't speak, and it's not like he has a job lined up for him. He's essentially starting over in a strange land, and you know this was not part of his plan. This was not how he envisioned that his life would go. On the journey of his life, this was a major detour. And maybe you can relate to that. Maybe you come to this time of the year, you look back over your life over the last year, you look at where you are, and you find yourself somewhere that you never expected to be. Maybe for you, it feels like you're stuck on a detour, an unexpected divorce, the death of someone you loved, an uncertain medical future, a lost job, a dead-end job, a job transfer, mental illness, depression, family drama, financial problems. All of that stuff can add up together to feeling like you've got yourself in a situation in which you're trapped. Or maybe it's not all the challenges. Maybe you just sort of feel stuck. I mean, yeah, you got a job, but it's not your dream job. It's not what you thought you'd be doing. And your family's okay, but it's not great. Just kind of there, and you're not sure there's any hope that things are going to get better in the future. Maybe you feel like you're stuck on a side road somewhere far away from where you thought you would be. So here's the question. How do you survive if you find yourself on a detour? 3 quick things. Here's the first one. You refuse to drift. You refuse to drift. One of the things I've learned about myself, and maybe you can relate to this, is if I get stuck on a detour, especially if it's going slow, I get disappointed. I have this plan for where I want to be. I didn't want to be here. I wanted to be there. And if I'm not careful, I can miss what's happening here because I'm not where I thought it would be. Then you start to get distracted, and disappointment and distraction almost always lead to drifting. But you look at the story of the escape to Egypt, and Joseph doesn't do that. Even though this was not what he expected, even though this was not what he thought his life would turn out to be, even though he's disappointed, he doesn't get distracted. He refuses to drift so that when God calls, he answers immediately. Check out verse 14. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night. Check that out. Middle of the night. They get up and they just leave everything behind and move to this new place. And left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. So was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." So God sends this angel, says, "Hey, you got to pick up everything, go to this place. You're not sure where you're going. When you get there, I'll tell you, you just go." And rather than trying to figure out a better way, rather than trying to figure out an easier path, Joseph simply responds when God calls. And it's a good thing he does. Because you read the next couple of verses, and Herod does something that we can't hardly imagine. Check out verse 16. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. And he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. Now the population estimates are, in that time period, this would have been somewhere between 20 and 30 babies. And in Herod's world, that didn't even make the front page. I mean, Herod killed hundreds of people. A couple dozen babies was no big deal. But to those parents, this was a big deal. Can you imagine having your baby ripped out of your arms and killed because of a paranoid ruler? They probably never got over it. But here's what you have to understand. If Joseph had drifted, if Joseph had decided, you know what, maybe we'll wait until the morning, maybe we'll come up with a better plan, maybe we'll figure out an easier way to do this, it's very possible that God's plan would have been derailed right from the beginning. Now, maybe God would have worked it out a different way. I don't know. I'm just saying, if Joseph had stayed where he was, it's very likely that the soldiers would have shown up and Jesus would have been one of those babies that was slaughtered. But because Joseph listened when God called, he was able to lead his family to safety in Egypt. I love what Chuck Swindoll said. He said, while we strain to see over the next horizon, God sees the map from above and so knows the best way to proceed. The truth is, sometimes what feels like a detour in your life is actually God redirecting your path to something better. A lot of times what feels like a delay is God protecting you from something. He's putting you in a place where you can discover some things about yourself or about Him that you never would have learned if it had all been smooth sailing on the main road. Other times He's got some stuff He wants you to accomplish, and He can't help you accomplish it until you get out of the fast lane and slow down and put your focus on Him. That's why our job, whenever you find yourself in a position where God's doing something you don't understand, is to refuse to drift. It's to stay close to Him. Romans 5, the Apostle Paul said it like this. He said, not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings. He's saying we glory in the detours and the delays because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. And hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who's been given to us. Paul came to a place in his life where he realized, hey, delays, detours, all that stuff is challenges. All that stuff's part of it. But God is using those things to transform me into the person He wants me to be. So rather than drifting, he stayed close. Here's a second thing you have to do in order to survive the detours. You have to choose to obey. In my opinion, Joseph is the most underappreciated person in the whole story. You know, you read the Christmas story, you know, Mary's kind of the hero and Jesus is the main character, but here's Joseph, here's this guy, man. Put yourself in his shoes. I mean, his fiance's just had this baby. Only thing he's sure about is that it's not his, and to make it worse, she claims that the baby she's carrying is God's son. Now, how would you react to that? You know what I mean? What would be your response? So he comes up with a plan that most of us would have followed. It says he was going to divorce her quietly, but then this angel shows up and says, Joseph, don't do that because she's telling you the truth. The baby she's carrying is actually God's son, and by the way, you've been chosen to raise God's son. Now, can you imagine what that conversation went like? For me, I'm thinking, man, if I went home today and an angel showed up and said, hey, you've been chosen to raise God's son, I'm thinking, you know, man, don't get me wrong here. I'm flattered that you offered that, but I'd be much better as a door greeter. You know, probably maybe drive the bus once in a while. I'll serve in the kids ministry, the kitchen cleanup crew. I mean, I'll take any job on the team except that one because that's the one job that you can't mess up. But rather than making excuses, Joseph accepts the responsibility. Then just when you think things would calm down and hey, it's going to be easy, it's going to be, you know, live happily ever after, the angel shows back up and he says, hey, you need to leave all your life behind, your family, your business contacts, your support network, and move to Egypt because there's this crazy guy that's trying to kill your family. You're going to live as a refugee in a foreign country. And all throughout the story, I mean, you read this, Joseph had way more questions than answers. It's not like he knew how all this was going to turn out, but at each critical junction, he chooses to obey God even when God's commands don't make sense to him. Isaiah 55, here's what the prophet writes. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Sometimes, I'll be honest, sometimes you look around, you try to figure out what God's up to, and it's hard to tell. Sometimes you have more questions than answers, and that's okay. You choose to obey even God, even if you can't see exactly what He's up to. Last thing, you use common sense and you pursue clarity. One of the questions we have when we read this story is just how long Joseph and Mary and Jesus stayed in Egypt. Matthew never tells us. The best guess is anywhere from a few months up to a couple years. But eventually this angel shows back up and he tells Joseph that crazy old Herod has died. The guy who started all this is now out of the picture. So you would think, all right, Joseph, it's time to pack up your stuff and let's go back home and get on with life. The only problem is at the end of his life, on his deathbed, Herod changed his will and he put one of his three sons, a guy named Archelaus, in charge of Israel. And the problem is that Archelaus was even crazier than his daddy. He was a nut. The first thing he did when he came to power as Israel is he gathered up 3,000 of his political enemies inside the temple complex and had them all executed right from the start. No rivals. So word of that, of course, gets back to Joseph. Joseph is on his way to a place where the guy has just executed 3,000 political rivals. So it doesn't take a genius to figure out you need to hit the brakes. You need to stop. I mean, if this guy will do that, he'll certainly kill a toddler. So Joseph does what a lot of us sometimes struggle to do. He hits the pause button. He thinks through the issue, and then he makes the best decision he can. And then the strangest thing happens. In the middle of all that, God confirms his decision. Check out verse 21. So he got up, took the child and his mother, and he went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. One of the things that sometimes happens, you find yourself in a spot, you're not sure what to do, you got a fork in the road, you're not sure which direction to go, is you just get paralyzed. You ever done that? The indecision sort of paralyzes you. I've been there, maybe you've been there. And the problem is if you stay in that position too long, just all your momentum stops and you just sort of get stuck. And whenever that happens, I'm convinced the best thing you can do is just hit the brakes, talk to some people you respect, pray about it, make the best decision you can, and then hope that the Lord confirms some things as you go along. Proverbs 16, here's what Solomon writes. He says, prudence is a fountain of life to the prudent, talking about wisdom, but folly brings punishment to fools. Now, a lot of times we rush into stuff without thinking. He's saying, hit the brakes, think it through, and then you pray. So you make a decision and you pray that if it's the right decision, the Lord will make that clear. You also pray if it's the wrong decision, the Lord will reveal that sooner rather than later. Well, see, Joseph decided he was going to do his best to protect his family. And in the process of that, as he moved forward, God opened doors and showed him which way he was supposed to go. And sometimes that's the way it works. Sometimes, you pray these really dramatic prayers and God gives you, this unmistakable sign. Here's exactly what you're supposed to do when you're supposed to do it. But I'm going to be honest with you. In my life, it doesn't work like that all the time. It's not always, registered letters from God and lightning bolts and you just know what to do. A lot of times you just make the best decision you can. You pray, you talk to people you admire and respect, and then you just pray that the Lord will open the right doors. And somehow in the process of all that, he does. But it starts with us making the best decision we can. And the really cool part of this, you get to verse 23, and you discover, even though the path was hard, even though there was a lot of twists and turns, a lot of delays, a lot of detours, they wind up in the exact right spot they were supposed to be. Check out verse 23. And he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. For hundreds of years, Old Testament scholars had read the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah, and they could not figure out how is it possible that one person could be born in Bethlehem, live in Egypt, and wind up in Nazareth. And to them, it seemed like there were all these different pieces from these different puzzles. They had no idea how God was going to weave all that together into one seamless story. But here's what I want you to remember. It's the result of all this. Always remember that God will get you where he wants you to be. If you don't drift, if you obey, if you pursue clarity, God will get you where he wants you to be. See, the whole time, you read the Christmas story, the whole time you're seeing all these bits and pieces, God is working behind the scenes to orchestrate the circumstances to get them where he wants them to be. So you think about the Christmas story, this angel shows up and there's Joseph and Mary and says, hey, you're going to have this baby. And then the Roman Empire has this census and moves them to Bethlehem. God caused the Roman Empire to hold a census. A little later, God wants these mysterious wise men to come and worship the newborn king, so he rearranges the stars. And then he wants Joseph and his family to go to Egypt, so he works through a crazy old king named Herod to force him to go there. Then when Herod passes away, he uses his even crazier son, Archelaus, to get him to go to Nazareth. I mean, it wasn't an easy trip. It wasn't what they expected, but the whole time, God was moving these pieces around to get them where he wanted them to be. So make sure you understand this. God the Father manipulates empires. He changes the hearts of pagan kings and corrupt officials. He suspends the laws of nature to accomplish his will. And here's the thing. If he did it for them, he can still do it for you. So with that in mind, there's one more sign I want you to see. And it's this one. Some of you here this morning may feel like you're stuck. You may feel like you're on a detour. For Joseph, it was a detour that lasted most of his earthly life as he did his best to raise Jesus. You read his story, and he's in the fight of his life from start to finish. And I'm sure for him, it felt like he was losing a lot more than he was winning. But he refused to drift. Some of you here this morning may be in a situation where you need to keep moving. You've been in a situation, maybe you find yourself over the last few months of this year stuck somewhere you never thought you'd be. And I want to encourage you to keep moving. Because as you keep moving, God keeps working to get you to where he wants you to be. Others of you here this morning may need to take a very direct step toward Christ. You know, the reason some of you feel stuck is because you've never been on the right path to start with. And the one thing you learn from the Christmas story is just how far God was willing to go to have a relationship with you. You read this story, man, it's obvious. There's not much else he could do. He sends his one and only son, leaves behind all the glories of heaven to come to this fallen, broken earth, to hang out with sinful, messed up, self-centered people like you and me. And then he gives us the opportunity to be adopted into his family. That's what the Christmas story is all about. I want you to stand. We're going to close today with an invitation song. The way this normally works is if you're here and you feel like you need to pray with somebody, you feel like you need to make a decision to follow Christ, you don't have to say anything. We won't embarrass you. We'll just help you navigate all of this. You come as we sing to one of these front seats, and David and I will be here to help you walk you through this.